Hey guys, Zane from the Infinite Jukebox here with another entry in the Rapid Record Recap, a monthly series that I do where I talk about all of the records I heard in a single month that I just, for some reason or another, didn't get a chance to do full-length reviews on in any capacity. And more importantly than that, it's also a series that I have been wildly behind on for literally months on end at this point that I am finally finishing catching up on. Today, I'm talking about August of 2023, all the albums from that month of the current year that I heard, that I didn't talk about. Let's go. Chris Farren, Doomsinger. This is singer-slash-songwriter Chris Farren's latest studio album, Doomsinger, and arguably his best yet, if I'm being totally honest. I mean, it isn't a consistently perfect album or anything like that, but at the same time, tracks like Cosmic Leash have such striking choruses and such well-written lyrics that it's hard to not fall in love with them over the course of a few different listens. The record also really allows Chris to shine as a song composer, and the fact that he leans into his more power pop tendencies and in turn his more melodic tendencies here especially highlights that. I feel like there's a lot of great songwriting from just a compositional standpoint here. Plus, his songwriting on cuts like Only You is genuinely really moving, ranging from heartbroken to heartfelt. As a whole, I just think this is a really great record and one that I highly recommend if you're into power pop, melodic pop rock of any kind. I'm going to give this record 4 stars out of 5. The Hives, The Death of Randy Fitzsimmons. I don't know who Randy is, but considering the Hives came back from an over 10-year hiatus just to make this album about his death, I'm gonna go with he probably had it coming to him. This is the first album from arguably pioneer garage rock revivalists, the Hives, in over 10 years, and it's solid, but it still succumbs to the same issues that the releases in their 2000s heyday did. The choruses blend together, the guitar tone is nice, but the individual tracks don't really have any flavor as a whole. They don't really have unique identities artistically. It's got a lot of energy behind it, but one can only do so much with energy when every song starts to blend together after a while. It's still a decent album, and if you want a relatively brief and fun record, it's recommendable, especially if you're a fan of the Hive's previous work, and it's nice to see them come back, considering garage rock revival bands don't really have a good reputation for sticking around a long time, unless they're called the Arctic Monkeys. So, you know what? Solid album. I'm going to give this record 3 stars out of 5. DJ Sabrina, the Teenage DJ, Destiny. Considering this album is roughly 4 hours long and not really meant to be listened to from front to back over and over again, I don't really feel comfortable giving it a rating, but I still kind of wanted to give it a mention because it's a really, really fun record, so long as you're just cherry-picking tracks, which is kind of what you're meant to do. A lot of the odd sample choices here and avant-garde compositional qualities make sure that Destiny feels very unique within the space of house music at the moment. The semi-psychedelic production makes everything feel very trippy, but at the same time there's a groundedness within the realm of, again, just straightforward electronic house music that definitely gives everything some weight and doesn't leave the entire record just floating off into sort of obscure avant-garde tendencies. And as a whole, I just think that's an excellently put together album. It's really great stuff, especially within the field of electronic in particular, if that's one of your interests. And I have to say, you know, if you want to give it a go, just pick some tracks with titles that interest you and see how you feel, because I don't feel comfortable giving this a rating, but I do feel comfortable enough to recommend it to you. Osees, Intercepted Message. After last year's extremely disappointing A Foul Form, a sort of experiment with hardcore and punk that the Osees put out, I found myself not really being too excited for another album from the collective. I mean, they've put out great stuff in the past, but, I mean, I was far from enjoying A Foul Form, and I just wasn't expecting too much from a follow-up. But here we are, and you know what? Intercepted Message is quite good. There's a certain laid-back energy here that I really like, even though the album itself still has a lot of bite behind it, with a lot of the punkish influences from that aforementioned record, as well as other albums in the Osees discography for that matter, still being present just in a more synth-based synth-punk form. There's a lot of interesting krautrock influences here too, on some of the more repetitious tracks like Die Laughing, as they kind of continuously evolve throughout their runtimes, acting as, again, these really great examples of what krautrock can be in terms of contemporary alternative bands, and not just the few bands from the late 60s and early 70s that tend to get mentioned within that particular genre. The decision to close out the album with the intentionally campy, schmaltzy 80s ballad Always at Night goes way better than expected, honestly. I mean, it's probably the weakest track on the record as a whole, and it's not even that great of a song, but at the same time, it's a very Osees choice, if you will. Do with that information what you want to. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. Addison Rae, AR. If I had $1 for every time I thought I'd be covering any music by Addison Rae on this channel, I would be homeless. Miraculously, not a bad EP. I mean, as a whole, it feels like it lacks a little bit of identity if you stripped away Addison's vocals and everything relating to her vocals, like the lyrics. I feel like this would just come across as some pretty average, middle-of-the-road, like, instrumentals to a Dua Lipa deep cut. But you know what? The songwriting's weirdly strong. Her vocals are still decent, and as a whole, this is way better than it should be. Look, I'm not trying to dismiss Addison Rae completely as a creative force just because of her past social media presence, but at the same time, I don't think I'm in the minority when I say I wasn't expecting this to be good. So yeah, not a masterpiece, but not a bad effort at all, and I'm actually going to keep an eye out for music Addison Rae puts out in the future. That's a sentence I never thought I'd say. I'm going to give this EP 3 stars out of 5. Fiddlehead, Death is Nothing to Us. This is the third studio album from American post-hardcore band Fiddlehead, and it's this close to being solid, but unfortunately it's just too flawed of a record for me to really want to return to it. A lot of the instrumentation here is pretty decent overall, but unfortunately the vast majority of the tracks here are just a couple minutes maximum, and I guess that works fine for some of the more punk-oriented tracks towards the beginning of the record, but once you get deeper into the waters of more college radio alt-rock, it definitely leaves things feeling a bit limited and a bit underdeveloped from song to song. Pat Flynn's vocals also just aren't necessarily for me, and I also believe that the usage of characters like Loserman is a really interesting concept, and very, very little is done with it here. I think that there were a lot of opportunities for Fiddlehead to really define themselves out of the post-hardcore crowd here, and I just don't really think they managed to do anything particularly stand out that other bands haven't already been doing for a while now musically. I'm going to give this record 2.5 stars out of 5. Horrendous, Ontological Mysterium. The latest studio album from American death metal band Horrendous, and you know what? It's pretty good. Really good, even. The main focus here, to me, is the instrumentation, which has this sort of classic thrash death feel to it overall that I can really get behind personally, yet at the same time, there's a bit of a hardcore/punk influence here that really adds a certain punch to things and ensures that the record doesn't just feel like repetition of older death metal sounds or anything like that. This is very fresh. The dense sound quality works well, and the sludginess of the album closer, The Death Knell Ringeth, which is a major highlight for me, is something that I find myself really head over heels in love with, probably one of the best death metal, or even metal tracks in general of the year up to this point. So yeah, pretty strong record. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. Quavo, Rocket Power. This is the most recent release from Quavo, former member of Migos, and for those who aren't aware of the history of Migos up to this point, the other member of Migos, the other 1/3 of Migos, I should specify, as well as Quavo's nephew, Takeoff, was shot and killed not very long ago, and it was a devastating moment for the hip-hop community, especially for a man who kind of pioneered trap into the mainstream for a very long period of time, all things considered. Of course, a good chunk of this record does touch on that topic regarding how Quavo feels about Takeoff's death, how Takeoff affected the people around him, as well as Quavo having some moments of introspection, discussing things like life and death and tragedy, and a variety of things that obviously aren't the happiest feelings in the world, but nonetheless are presented in a fairly personal and deep way that I honestly wouldn't expect from Quavo. It's sad that this had to happen to get him to the point that he can do something so personal, but, you know, unfortunately, tragedy leads to great music sometimes. I do apologize if this one feels a little bit more rambled than the others. It's just that I didn't feel comfortable writing any sort of major script about Takeoff's passing or anything like that. Again, it was a tragic moment in the context of modern hip-hop and music in general, for that matter. And to have an album that's so heavily structured around that, it's definitely kind of brutal to hear those moments. Unfortunately, there are a lot of qualities about this record that make it kind of hard for me to get behind totally and say that it's this very recommendable album and stuff like that. I mean, the instrumentals are fine, but they don't really leave too much of a mark, and a lot of the less personal songs on this record are pretty typical Quavo fare overall, nothing particularly spectacular. That being said, the stretch from Mama Told Me to Where Do I Start, as well as the album closer Greatness, are all very, very strong tracks, and if you really are into Quavo, his sound, and his style, and the style that Migos presented when they were around, I would say check this one out for those songs alone. It really is a shame that the entire album, all 18 tracks here, can't really live up to that one particular stretch of songs, because I feel like if it did, you would have a much better record on your hands, but as it stands, the deeper, more personal moments here really do stand out as some of the most raw material Quavo has put out to date. I'm going to give this record 3 stars out of 5, and rest in peace, Takeoff. Genesis Owusu, Struggler. Struggler? I hardly know her. I think that there are a lot of really interesting ideas on Struggler. I just don't really think the execution lives up to the excellent and much more musically versatile Smiling with No Teeth, easily one of the best debut albums we've gotten from any artist over the past few years. For the most part, the more upbeat post-punk, dance-punk vibes just don't really cut it for me, if I'm being totally honest. And I think that some of the more experimental ideas on this record are interesting, they just aren't really pulled off the greatest. For example, the recurring lyrical motif of the roach, I think it's pretty intriguing, albeit a little bit cliche, perhaps. And as a whole, I think that some of the lyrical content on songs like Freak Boy is even a little bit cheesy. Like, for example, in the track Freak Boy, you have the lyrics, I know you freaky, but you gotta keep your shit in your pants. And it's not lazy writing, it just feels like if the kitten in a Hang In There Baby poster had a knife, and that's not really the highest of compliments, I don't think. Stuck to the Fan ends things off pretty uninterestingly and really not very memorably to me as well. And as a whole, I think there are a lot of cool ideas here and a lot of concepts that could have beautifully followed up Smiling with No Teeth perfectly. But overall, I think that this is a major downgrade from what was a brilliant debut album. Even if there are enough intriguing concepts here and the first couple of tracks are great, for me to say this is still a decent record, it's just one that I wanted to be so much better. I'm going to give this record 3 stars out of 5. Mick Jenkins, The Patience. Chicago rapper Mick Jenkins back with another full-length studio album, and while it is a step up from some of his previous releases, I do still kind of think that it needs a little bit of work, but nonetheless, what is here is pretty strong. Mick definitely has personality, he raps over some pretty decent instrumentals, but his lyrical game needs to step up at least a little bit. I mean, most of the time it doesn't feel like he's saying much of substance, especially his inspirational lines, which aren't really corny, but they aren't particularly powerful in any way. They're just kind of neutral, and that's the opposite of what you want. The Patience does really benefit from some strong features from people like J.I.D., Freddie Gibbs, and Benny the Butcher, who pretty much saved this record from pure mediocrity, even if the features do begin to dry up towards the end of the record. And as a whole, this is still an alright album. It's just not the best that I think Mick Jenkins can put out, and I really hope that he continues to kind of get things down for himself stylistically so that he can put out the great album that I'm pretty confident he can. I'm going to give this record 3 stars out of 5. Jon Batiste, World Music Radio. You don't realize how ready I was to defend this album, to the very bitter end for that matter. His 2021 album, We Are, was a pretty strong effort overall. It incorporated a variety of interesting influences, ranging from pop to soul to funk, in a lot of pretty unique ways overall. Do I think it deserved to win the 2022 Grammy for Album of the Year? No, because no normal person thinks that, even though it did. But at the same time, I still feel like it got a bit overlooked by the general public, even if it did win the music award to end them all. Now, World Music Radio, this is an entirely different story. World Music Radio has a lot of interesting concepts, but it never really runs with any of them. I like the idea of this radio station that's constantly playing different songs from different styles and genres from around the world geographically. I think it's an interesting concept and not one that you see too terribly often or anything like that. It's a pretty unique idea, and it's a shame that none of the songs here particularly dive into anything that feels super unique or distinct or even all that passionate about these different forms of music that they're trying to take on. There's also a huge lack of fluidity here, and I think that's a real shame, honestly. I mean, I do understand that the concept is a radio station, and as such, of course it would bounce around from song to song, style to style, with no real sense of connectivity between any of them, but there have been other albums with somewhat similar concepts that have managed to have a lot of fluidity to them overall. Obviously, it's from a very different genre, but a great example of this is Songs for the Deaf by Queens of the Stone Age. I think that ultimately it's an album that utilizes the concept of radio station playing a variety of different songs within the same ballpark, but different styles, but managing to connect them. For example, this record, it just has basic radio station-esque interludes and commercials and hosts speaking between them. It's not all that complicated, and it feels like it would be such a simple way for World Music Radio to just put things together a little bit more, add at least one more piece to an already very incomplete puzzle, but it doesn't even do that. It just feels like there's a serious lack of care for every single idea going into this record. Features from Jid and New Jeans, they're alright, they're there, they're pretty fun overall, but that's just the extent of it, and Batiste himself lacks virtually any and all personality. This is a really disappointing record. I'm going to give this album 2 stars out of 5. Rhiannon Giddens, You're the One. You're the One is at its absolute best when it leans into its more folksy and Americana influences on tracks like You Louisiana Man and the Jason Isbell collab Yet to Be. They're songs that are executed pretty perfectly for what they are. Simple, semi-traditionalistic Americana folk country songs, and hey, you know what? They're good tracks. It just so happens that vocal jazz songs, which heavily outweigh the more traditional country folk songs here, are not nearly as well done. It's still a decent listen because of the fact that you do have a lot of very strong tracks here, as already mentioned, but at the same time, the vocal jazz influences, they feel pretty uninspired, and I think that this record could have gone much further in terms of quality had it leaned into one side and not so much the other, and I think you can guess where my heart lies there. I'm going to give this record 3 stars out of 5. Blank Banshee, 4D. This is a very well-produced album, but it just feels a little bit too disorganized to really work as a full-on listening experience. This really just comes across as a series of very well-made, albeit completely unconnected, experimental vignettes that really portray a lot of different niches within the realm of electronic music, whether it be dance music, or techno, or vaporwave, etc., etc. I also do think that some tracks here are too short for their own good, but as a whole, I think it's a very adventurous, very experimental, and pretty daring album overall, and I definitely enjoy it from that particular perspective, and I have a pretty deep respect for it because of that. Blank Banshee have never failed to surprise since they first came onto the scene in the early 2010s, and it's no different in 2023. I'm going to give this record 3 stars out of 5. Open Mike Eagle, another triumph of ghetto engineering. While this is arguably the least conceptual Open Mike Eagle album to date, it definitely makes up for it by having more fun than pretty much anything that Mike has done within recent memory. I mean, a lot of the overarching themes of records like Anime, Trauma, and Divorce are completely gone, tossed out the window for the sake of this record, but it really does sound like Mike is having way more fun making art than he has in quite some time here, and because of that, his infectious enjoyment of creating this kind of passes over to the listener as well. The instrumentals are strong, the features are generally pretty great, and add in some nerdy, pop culture-laden lyrics for the most part, and you've got pretty much all the components that make a really great Open Mike Eagle record. And you know what? This one's pretty great. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. Blut aus Nord, Disharmonium Nahab. This is the latest from avant-garde icons within the realm of metal, Blut Nord, as well as their second entry in what is going to be the trilogy Disharmonium series. And you know what? It's great as always. It's colossal. The album cover is pretty fitting with these very abstract horrors coming out of the sky. It kind of feels like it's a pretty accurate representation of what's on display here musically. The dissonance of a lot of the guitar work and riff work here is fantastic, and there's this sort of looming giant quality about this record that I personally can really dig into, and I'm very excited to see how they wrap up the trilogy, as this is another great entry in it. I'm going to give this record 4 stars out of 5. Asia Menor, Enola Gay. And on today's episode of If You're Aware of This Album, You Probably Use Rate Your Music, Enola Gay by Asia Menor, the debut studio album from the Chilean indie rock band that's getting a lot of hype in very, very, very specific circles of music nerds. There's an extremely passionate enthusiasm ingrained into every single second of this record, even in the more chill and laid-back moments that, again, is just so infectious. It really gets to you, and you can tell how much the band is enjoying recording and performing and how passionate they are about the art that they make, and it makes for some pretty empowering instrumental and vocal performances alike. Even then, ignoring the actual feeling of the album, the record is compositionally strong, there are a lot of really memorable passages in terms of melody. I feel like there's a good bit of emotional punch to this record overall, even though I do think a lot of people click with it more in that regard more than I do personally. And yeah, as a whole, really good debut and definitely a band to keep an eye out on. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. Victoria Monet, Jaguar 2. This is the second and final entry in the duology of the Jaguar series of records, and at times this is better than its predecessor. Victoria Monet has a gentle yet very commanding presence overall. She's very engaging, but at the same time she's also technically proficient as a vocalist. A lot of the instrumentals here are well executed, whether it be a more laid-back sense of soul on tracks like Hollywood, or more up-tempo funk covers like, say, On My Mama, for example. And there's also a lot of moments here that I would say maybe are some of the best things that Victoria Monet has done to date, particularly the album opener Smoke, which is possibly my favorite song she's ever put out. Yes, I know she only has 2 albums and like a few EPs out. I'm trying to make a point. I do wish this was longer just so it had a bit more finality in regards to it closing out the Jaguar duology of records, but at the same time, it's still a very good listen. I'm going to give this album 3.5 stars out of 5. Ashnikko, Weedkiller. I don't hate this as much as some people do, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, sure, Ashnikko's entire persona can be a good bit obnoxious a lot of the time, but I personally can get behind an artist that intentionally tries to antagonize their audience, but at the same time that doesn't really mean that songs like Don't Look At It are inherently good because they're intentionally annoying and antagonistic in an over-the-top sense. It's still bad. Other than that, honestly, vocally, fine, instrumentals, mediocre at best, and there's even a couple of decent tracks here. I think that Miss Nectarine's alright. I think that Chokehold Cherry Python is a pretty fun song. It's just that there's not enough here to save it from being wildly unremarkable. I've seen a lot of people just absolutely despise this record, and I can get it. I understand the hate, but at the same time, I don't know. I'm a hater, just not for this record in particular. I'm going to give this record 2.5 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that is the end of the rapid record recap for August of 2023. All the albums I heard in the month that I didn't get a chance to review for one reason or another. There was a point where I didn't get to review stuff because I didn't have time to do it or because I didn't want to. And then I thought at the end of the month, well, hey, this is the last I got to do of catch up, and then I'll be cool. And then like a week later, my power went out for almost half a week. So I'm just going to pretend like I don't know what's going to happen. Because obviously me having energy to do things results in my power going out. But other than that, that is the end of the Rapid Record Recap. I've been Zane from the Infinite Jukebox. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.